Okay, so I bet you're interested in this idea of fingerprinting and photographing people in the Canadian legal system, right?
Definitely a fascinating area.
Yeah. And for this deep dive, you've actually given us a chapter straight from a police recruit manual,
Yeah.
which is really cool. It's kind of like we're getting a peek behind the curtain and seeing how law enforcement officers are actually taught about these procedures.
Uh-huh.
And our mission is to sort of understand the ins and outs of fingerprinting and photographing here in Canada, especially focusing on the Identification of Criminals Act
Mm,
and how that sort of plays out in real life.
that's right. And it's interesting, the manual doesn't just like lay out all these dry legal rules.
Yeah.
It actually starts with some pretty gripping examples of how fingerprints and photographs have been used to solve crimes,
Right.
even cases that seem like they were impossible to solve.
Right. They talk about situations where fingerprints help to actually catch the bad guy,
Yeah.
but then also other examples where fingerprints were used to prove someone innocent.
Yeah, that's right.
Talk about high stakes, right?
Absolutely.
Like, just
Yeah.
imagine a fingerprint could be the thing that places someone at a crime scene or connects them to a weapon
Oh, for sure.
or even clears their name completely.
Huge implications.
Huge. And it's not just about fingerprints, is it? Photographs are really important too.
Photographs are absolutely crucial.
Yeah.
They're used for witness identification. They help track down suspects. They can even just help officers remember, key details about a case months or even years later.
Yeah.
And then, of course, they can be used in those public appeals to help identify dangerous individuals. So there's that public safety element as well.
Right. So these tools, they're all about making sure that the justice system is accurate, it's fair, and it's efficient.
Mm-hmm.
So we want to make sure we identify the right people.
For sure.
We want to make sure everyone's treated justly, and we want to use our resources effectively to do all of that.
Right. We want to make sure the system is actually working.
Exactly. Now let's sort of get into the legal side of things, the framework behind all of this.
Okay.
A big part of that is this thing called the Identification of Criminals Act.
Yeah.
So what does this act actually allow? Like, what does it say the police can do?
Well, basically, the act is like the foundation for how fingerprinting and photographing are used by law enforcement here in Canada.
Yeah.
It lays out, who can be fingerprinted or
Yeah.
photographed, under what circumstances, and what can be done with that information.
So I think people are probably wondering, like, when can the police actually take my fingerprints?
Yeah, that's the big question, right?
Right. And the act actually lays out three sort of main scenarios where that would be allowed.
Uh-huh.
So what's that first scenario? When can they take your fingerprints?
Okay, so the first one's pretty straightforward.
Okay.
If someone is in lawful custody
Okay.
and they've been convicted of an indictable offense,
Yeah.
those more serious crimes,
Yeah.
then they can be fingerprinted and photographed.
So if they're, let's say, already serving time for assault or something, then it's just like standard procedure to fingerprint and photograph them.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, that makes sense.
The second scenario is really similar.
Oh,
Let's
wow.
say someone's been charged with an indictable offense,
Right?
but they haven't been convicted yet. Maybe they're in custody awaiting trial.
Yeah.
They can be fingerprinted and photographed as well.
Okay, so that kind of makes sense. It follows along with the first one,
Uh-huh.
but this is where it gets a little more complicated, right?
A little bit.
There's this third scenario where someone hasn't even been officially charged with a crime,
Right.
and they can still be fingerprinted.
That's right.
So I think people might be thinking, wait, hold on, they can take my fingerprints even if I haven't been charged.
Yeah, I can imagine people would be concerned about that.
Yeah.
And the answer is yes, but only in very, very specific situations.
Okay, so what are those situations? What are we talking about here?
Okay, so first, the person has to be alleged to have committed an indictable offense,
Okay.
meaning there needs to be some reason to suspect them, but it doesn't have to be like the same level of proof as an actual charge.
Right. So there's some evidence, but maybe not enough to actually, like, lay a charge.
Right, exactly.
Right.
And in this scenario, they have to be formally summoned to appear,
Right.
either through an appearance notice or an undertaking or a summons.
Right.
It's not just a casual, hey, can you come down to the station? It's a legal document
Yeah.
that compels them to appear for the specific purpose of being fingerprinted and photographed.
Right. So it's not just like they can show up and then, be surprised by this whole thing.
Exactly. It's very clear why they're being asked to come in.
Yeah. So this distinction between being charged and simply being alleged is really important,
It is, yeah.
especially when we're talking about people's rights.
Absolutely.
And the manual actually points out that this applies to young people as well.
Yes, that's important to note. youth justice proceedings have their own, kind of nuances.
Yeah.
But the Identification of Criminals Act still plays a role when we're talking about young people who are alleged to have committed these more serious crimes.
Okay, so we've talked about like the who can be fingerprinted and the when they can be fingerprinted.
Right.
But what about like the what? Like what can actually be done? Is it more than just taking fingerprints and photos?
Well, the act actually gives law enforcement some pretty significant powers.
Okay.
So first of all, it allows them to use force if someone refuses to be fingerprinted or photographed.
Whoa. Okay, that sounds intense.
Yeah, it can be, and that's why the act really emphasizes using caution and following proper procedures.
Yeah.
We're talking about potentially using force on someone who hasn't even been convicted of anything.
Right.
So it's definitely a serious thing.
So like if someone just refuses to cooperate, what happens then?
Well, the manual actually recommends laying a formal charge
Okay.
before they resort to using force. That way, there's no question about whether the person was formally charged with an indictable offense before those fingerprints and photos were taken.
So it's all about like protecting everyone's rights and making sure that everything's done by the book.
That's right.
Yeah.
And another really important thing about the act
Yeah.
is that it allows law enforcement to share this information.
Right.
So not just locally, but potentially nationally or even internationally.
So it's not just like sitting in a database in like a small town somewhere. It could be used to solve crimes or track down like fugitives across borders.
Exactly. And that can be incredibly valuable, sharing that kind of information.
Yeah.
The manual highlights a few key ways that fingerprints are actually used. For example, they're checked against the CPIC Criminal Name Index, or CNI.
Okay, I think I've heard of CPIC,
Okay.
but what is that exactly?
Well, it's a national database. It's basically like a massive library of criminal history. It includes things like outstanding warrants, past convictions, court appearances, even flags that might indicate specific risks or behaviors.
Wow, so when someone gets fingerprinted, they're basically being checked against this huge database of information.
That's right. And the CNI can actually reveal someone's past even if they've used different names or aliases.
Oh, wow.
It's like a puzzle
Yeah.
where the fingerprints are the missing pieces.
So even if someone tries to hide their true identity, their fingerprints can, like, betray them and reveal who they really are.
Exactly. It's pretty powerful.
That's powerful stuff. Okay, so we've talked about fingerprints, but what about the photos? How are those used beyond just identification?
Well, one thing that's interesting is that officers can actually add those arrest photos to their notes.
Okay.
So it's kind of like a visual aid to help them remember specific details about the suspect's appearance.
Right, so it's almost like, you know how some people use photos to remember names? It's
Exactly.
that same kind of thing.
Yeah, it's like a visual reminder.
But there's a catch, right?
There is.
It has to be a photo from the current arrest,
That's right. Yeah.
right? Because someone's appearance can change a lot over time.
Uh-huh.
So the idea is to have like a record of what they look like at the time of that specific arrest.
Right. Yeah.
And that photo has to be disclosed to both the Crown and the defense as part of the case file.
Right.
So it's not just like a casual snapshot they took.
No, it's official evidence.
It's official evidence, yeah.
Yeah.
So we talked about officers using photos in their notes,
Yeah.
but photos are also used for like those public appeals, right?
Absolutely. Like those wanted posters,
Yes.
or when they release photos to the media to try to find a missing person,
Yeah.
or even just someone they want to question.
The manual actually shows some examples of those, which is cool.
Yeah, it's a good visual.
It's like it brings it to life.
Uh-huh.
So far, we've been really focusing on the Identification of Criminals Act,
Right.
but are there other ways that fingerprints and photographs can be obtained by law enforcement?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Like what else is out there?
Well, one of the key ways is through consent.
Okay.
So someone can voluntarily agree to be fingerprinted or photographed.
So they're not being forced, but there's some rules around that, right?
Absolutely. It has to be informed consent,
Okay.
meaning the person understands what they're agreeing to and they're aware of what the potential consequences could be.
You can't just like trick someone into giving you their fingerprints.
Right. It has to be a genuine informed choice.
And the manual actually gives a really good example of this, like in practice.
Yeah.
Let's say there's been a break-in.
Uh-huh.
The police might ask the people who live there,
Yeah.
hey, would you be willing to give your fingerprints just to rule you out as suspects?
Right.
Because obviously their fingerprints might be there just because they live there.
Exactly.
So getting those voluntary fingerprints can help the investigators kind of narrow down the search and find the actual burglar's prints.
It helps eliminate possibilities
Yeah, totally.
and focus on the right evidence.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So, okay, consent is one pathway. What else is there?
Well, another way is through common law,
Okay.
which basically refers to those legal principles that have been established through court decisions over time.
So it's less about like a specific act and more about how judges have interpreted the law.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So with common law, it's pretty clear that photographing someone to help with note-taking is generally allowed.
Okay.
But when it comes to fingerprinting, it gets a bit more murky.
Okay.
There have been cases where courts have said, taking photographs for identification after an arrest doesn't necessarily violate someone's charter rights.
Okay.
But those cases haven't really addressed whether force can be used.
Right. So if someone's resisting having their picture taken, it gets a little more complicated.
Yeah, it's a bit of a gray area there.
Speaking of pictures, what about photos taken in public places? Like security cameras or someone just taking pictures on the street?
So in this context, we're talking about law enforcement taking photos. And generally it's allowed as long as they're not using force or trespassing or any other intrusive methods.
So no, like barging into someone's home and snapping pictures?
Yeah, no, definitely not.
Okay.
There was actually a case, RV Elzin, where the police videotaped and photographed a suspect from outside a business.
Okay.
And the court said that was okay because the suspect didn't really have a reasonable expectation of privacy in that situation.
So if you're in public, you're fair game for the camera.
Well, generally speaking, yeah.
Okay.
Now, the last one we need to talk about is something called the Criminal Code Impression Warrant.
Okay, that sounds serious.
It does, yeah.
What's that all about?
It's basically a warrant that allows law enforcement to obtain bodily prints or impressions.
So we're talking about things like footprints, tire tracks, maybe even bite marks.
Exactly. Yeah, all those kinds of things.
Okay.
These warrants are used when investigators think those impressions could help them solve a crime.
But they can't just get one of these warrants whenever they want, can they?
Of course not. They have to go before a judge and convince them that there are good reasons to believe a crime has been committed.
Right.
That the impressions will actually provide some relevant information.
Yeah.
And that issuing the warrant is in the best interests of justice.
So there are, like, checks and balances to make sure these warrants aren't just used willy-nilly.
Absolutely. It's a powerful tool, but not one that can be used lightly.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here,
Yeah.
from that Identification of Criminals Act
Yeah.
to all these other ways that fingerprints and photos can be obtained.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm actually particularly intrigued by one of the things we touched on earlier, these photo packs.
Ah, yes, the photo packs. That's how all those mugshots we talked about actually get used to identify suspects.
Right.
It's a fascinating process, and there's a lot to unpack there.
I'm all ears. Let's dive into that next.
Well, okay, imagine this, right? You witness a crime,
yeah.
and the police are trying to figure out who did it. That's where these photo packs come in.
So a photo pack is basically like a bunch of photos they show to a witness
Right.
to see if they can, like, pick out the person who committed the crime.
Yeah. That's the basic idea. But it's not just a random stack of pictures. There's
Yeah.
a whole process
Yeah.
to make sure it's done fairly and to try to avoid any bias.
And that makes sense because eyewitness testimony can be kind of iffy, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Like, our memories aren't perfect,
Right.
and they can be influenced by all kinds of things, like stress or even just the way someone asks you a question.
Yeah, there's tons of research on this.
Yeah.
And it shows why having these clear, standardized procedures is so important when we're dealing with photo packs.
Okay, so, like, in practice, how does this actually work? What are the steps involved?
Well, the manual mentions that the exact procedures can vary a bit
Yeah.
from one police department to the next,
Right.
but there's a general framework that most of them follow.
All right, let's break it down.
Okay.
What's the first step?
So first, they got to create the photo pack itself.
Okay.
And they have to choose the photos really carefully,
Yeah.
make sure they're appropriate for the specific case.
Right, so finding the right photos is the first hurdle.
It is, and the way they choose those photos is actually pretty interesting.
Okay.
It kind of stems from this big inquiry back in the 1980s called the Safano Inquiry.
The Safano Inquiry, what was that all about?
Well, it was this case where a guy was wrongly convicted of murder,
Oh, wow.
largely based on faulty eyewitness identification.
Yikes.
Yeah, and the inquiry really exposed a lot of problems with how photo lineups were being done back then.
So that's like a stark reminder of why getting this ID stuff right is so important.
It is, absolutely.
So, okay, this inquiry, it actually led to some changes in how they do the whole photo pack thing.
It did, yeah, big changes.
Like what?
all designed to make the process more reliable
Yeah.
and try to prevent those wrongful convictions from happening again.
Okay, so what kind of changes are we talking about?
Well, one of the biggest ones was something called sequential presentation.
Sequential presentation. What's that?
Basically, instead of showing all the photos at once, like a lineup,
Right.
they show them one at a time,
Okay.
in random order.
Interesting.
This helps prevent the witness from just comparing the photos
Yeah.
and choosing the one that looks most like the suspect.
Right.
They have to actually focus on each individual photo
Yeah.
and decide if it matches their memory.
That makes a lot of sense.
It's a small change.
Yeah.
It can make a big difference.
For sure.
Another big change was the need for an independent presenter.
An independent presenter. Does that mean the person showing the photos doesn't know who the actual suspect is?
You got it.
Okay.
Again, this is all about avoiding any unintentional bias
Yeah.
or cues that could influence the witness.
Right. So even if the presenter doesn't mean to give anything away,
Yeah,
they might do it subconsciously.
exactly. Like body language,
Yeah.
tone of voice, that kind of stuff.
It's like a double-blind study in science, right?
That's a great analogy.
You're trying to remove as much bias as possible.
Exactly.
Okay, what else?
So, because of the Sofinu inquiry,
Yeah.
the whole photo pack procedure now has to be recorded and transcribed.
So there's like a permanent record
Mm-hmm.
to make sure everything's done above board.
That's right. Transparency and accountability.
Exactly. And it also allows for review later on,
Yeah.
in case there are any questions about how things were done.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've talked about creating that photo pack,
Yeah.
carefully choosing the photos.
Right.
We've talked about how the Sofino inquiry really changed things up.
Big time.
What happens next? What's the next step?
Well, got to properly instruct the witness.
Okay.
The presenter explains the whole process.
Yeah.
Emphasizes that the suspect may or may not actually be in the photo pack.
Okay.
And reminds them that they don't have to choose anyone.
Right. You don't want them to feel pressured
Absolutely. No pressure.
to just pick someone.
Right.
Okay, so setting those expectations is important.
It is.
And then comes the actual showing of the photos.
That's right. One at a time.
Right.
Random order,
Yeah.
presenter staying completely neutral.
No hints.
No hints. Yeah.
Okay, so what happens after that?
Well, then you got to carefully record the witness's responses,
Okay.
whether they identify someone or not.
And this is where those forms come in, right?
That's right.
The manual mentioned all these different forms that are used.
Tons of forms, yeah.
Yeah.
They have a checklist for putting the photo pack together,
Okay.
a ballot to record who the witness picks, instructions on how to mark the photos.
Wow.
It's super detailed.
Yeah, they don't mess around.
Nope.
It makes sense, though,
It does.
because this stuff is so important.
Mm-hmm.
You want to make sure you're doing it right.
Absolutely. So the whole thing is recorded, transcribed, all that,
Right.
to create that permanent record,
Yeah.
and then it all goes in the case file.
So both the prosecution and the defense can see it,
Exactly. Everyone's on the same page.
which is important for fairness, obviously.
And transparency is key.
Now, the manual mentions something called the Computer Automated Booking System,
CABS.
CABS. Okay.
That's basically the database where all those mugshots are stored.
Okay.
It lets officers search for photos
Yeah.
based on all sorts of criteria, like age or gender,
Uh-huh.
physical characteristics.
And then use that to create the photo packs.
Exactly.
So it's like a digital library of mugshots.
You got it.
But obviously with all these rules and procedures.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Okay, and the manual specifically said that not all booking photos can be used in a photo pack.
That's right.
Why not?
Well, for example, a youth booking photo can't be used in an adult photo pack.
Okay.
They want to protect the identities of young people.
Right. That makes sense.
It's about fairness,
Yeah.
making sure the photos are relevant to the case.
So we've talked about like putting together the photo pack,
Yeah.
instructing the witness,
Uh-huh.
the presentation itself,
Yeah. Right.
recording the results,
Yeah.
making sure everything's documented and disclosed.
That's a whole process.
It is a whole process. But even with all these procedures, I imagine eyewitness identification can still be tricky.
Oh, it definitely can.
Right. Our memories aren't perfect.
No, not at all.
And there's so many things that can affect how we remember stuff.
Especially stressful events.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So what are some of the specific things that make eyewitness IDs so, like, prone to error?
Well, there's a couple of key concepts that are important to understand.
Right.
First, we have something called estimator variables.
Estimator variables. Okay, that sounds technical.
It is a bit jargony.
Those?
They're basically factors that relate to the crime itself
Okay.
or the witness's experience
Yeah.
that can affect how accurate their memory is.
Okay.
The tricky thing is, these are things that are totally outside the control of the justice system.
So you're saying that things that happen during the crime itself can make it harder for a witness to remember things clearly.
Mm. That's exactly right.
Okay, I'm trying to picture this. Like, let's say there's a robbery
Yeah.
that happens at night. It's
Okay.
dark, the witness is far away from the robber.
Uh-huh.
Maybe the robber's wearing a mask.
Right.
Maybe there's a weapon involved.
All those things can affect their memory,
Yeah, and the witness is probably terrified.
of course.
So those memories might not be very clear.
That's the thing about memory, especially under stress.
Okay.
It's not always reliable.
And unfortunately, there's not much the justice system can do about that.
No, those are just inherent limitations
Yeah.
to how our brains work.
Okay, so those are estimator variables,
Yeah.
the things that happen during the crime.
Uh-huh.
But what about things that happen after the crime?
Okay, so those are called system variables.
System variables. So
Yeah.
like stuff related to how the investigation itself is carried out.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, and the good news is
Yeah.
these are things that the justice system can actually control,
Okay.
unlike those estimator variables. We can actually put procedures in place
Right.
to try to minimize their impact.
So what you're saying is that how the police interview witnesses or how they conduct these photo lineups
Yeah.
can actually affect the witness's memory.
It can, yeah.
Wow, that's crazy.
It is, right.
So give me an example, like how could that happen?
Okay, so let's say the police are interviewing a witness
Yeah.
and they use leading questions.
Okay.
Or they kind of accidentally suggest that they think a particular person is the suspect.
Yeah.
That can actually subtly change the witness's memory,
Wow.
even if that person wasn't actually the one who did it.
So even these seemingly small details
Mhm.
can really mess with how someone remembers something.
They can. It's all about the power of suggestion.
And that's why all those safeguards we talked about earlier are so important.
Absolutely.
That sequential presentation, the independent presenter recording everything.
Yep.
It's all about minimizing the influence of those system variables.
Right. We're trying to make eyewitness identification as reliable as
Mhm.
possible.
So it's like we're creating a system that knows that memory isn't perfect
Uh-huh.
and it's trying to protect against those errors and biases.
That's a great way to put it.
But even with all these procedures in place, I guess eyewitness identification can still be wrong sometimes.
It can. Yeah.
So it should never be like the only evidence used to convict someone.
You're right. It needs to be considered along with all the other evidence in the case.
Yeah.
And everyone needs to be aware that
Yeah.
mistakes can happen.
Absolutely.
It's a good reminder that human memory, even with the best intentions, can be unreliable.
Yeah.
The justice system has to constantly be on guard against wrongful convictions.
Okay, so we've learned about that Identification of Criminals Act.
Mm-hmm.
All those different ways fingerprints and photos can be obtained.
Yeah.
And this whole intricate process of using photo packs.
It's a lot, right?
It is. It's fascinating to see how something that seems so straightforward on the surface actually involves so many layers of like law and procedure and even psychology.
It's like this intersection of law enforcement and human behavior.
Right.
It's really interesting.
And it makes you think about that balance
Yeah.
between doing effective law enforcement,
Right.
but also making sure we're protecting people's rights.
For sure.
We've seen how the act tries to find that sweet spot,
Uh-huh.
giving the police the tools they need,
Yeah.
but also respecting individual rights.
It's a delicate balance.
It is.
For sure.
And we've seen how those fingerprints, they're like a key
Yeah.
that can unlock a ton of information about someone's past.
Through that CPIC database.
Right, which can be really important
Right.
for making all sorts of decisions
Uh-huh.
about arrests and bail and things like that.
It's valuable information.
And then, of course, we talked about the photos
Right.
and how they're used in so many different ways.
So many ways. Yeah.
From jogging an officer's memory
Yep.
to being used in those public appeals
Uh-huh.
to playing a key role in those carefully constructed photo packs.
For those eyewitness identifications.
Exactly. And we talked about how the Safino inquiry led to all those important changes in that process.
Right. To try to make it more reliable.
Yeah. Sequential presentation,
Mhm.
independent presenters,
Recording everything.
all designed to try to prevent those wrongful convictions.
It all comes back to that, right? Making
Yeah.
sure the system is fair and accurate.
Exactly. Because at the end of the day, we're talking about people's lives.
That's right. The stakes are high.
Absolutely. It really is kind of mind-blowing when you think about it.
It is.
How something as simple as, taking someone's fingerprint or a photo can have such huge implications.
Absolutely. And it all comes back to that balance, right?
Yeah.
Between effective law enforcement and protecting individual rights.
Right. We want to make sure the police have the tools they need,
Uh-huh.
but we also want to make sure people's rights are being respected.
It's a constant balancing act, for sure.
So as we sort of wrap up this deep dive into the world of fingerprints and photographs in the Canadian legal system,
Uh-huh.
what are some of the big things you think our listeners should really take away from all of this?
Well, I think the biggest thing is just a better understanding of that legal framework
Right.
that governs all these procedures,
Yeah.
especially the Identification of Criminals Act,
Right.
and how it outlines those specific situations where fingerprinting and photographing are allowed.
Yeah, we talked about those different scenarios.
We did.
It's not always black and white.
No, it's not as simple as you might think.
Someone doesn't necessarily have to be convicted of a crime
Right.
to have their fingerprints or photo taken.
There are those other pathways, like being charged with an indictable offense.
Right, or even just being alleged to have committed one and being summoned for that specific purpose.
Yeah, and it's important to understand those distinctions.
It is, yeah, especially when we're talking about protecting the rights of someone who hasn't actually been found guilty of anything.
Absolutely. The presumption of innocence is crucial.
Another thing that really struck me was just the sheer power of those fingerprints.
Oh, yeah.
It's amazing how much information they can reveal about someone's past.
It's like a window into their history.
Right. Through that CPIC database.
It can be super valuable for making all sorts of decisions.
Right, like about whether to arrest someone
Uh,
or what kind of bail conditions to set.
yeah, it helps ensure public safety.
And then, of course, we can't forget about those photos.
The photos are crucial, too.
Yeah, we saw how they're used for all sorts of things.
All kinds of things. Yeah, everything from helping an officer remember a suspect's face to
Yeah.
appearing on those wanted posters to being used in those meticulously constructed photo packs for eyewitness identification.
Right, and speaking of those photo packs, I think that whole process was a real eye-opener for a lot of people.
It is. It's fascinating how much detail goes into it.
Yeah, and for good reason.
Mm-hmm.
We talk about how eyewitness identification can be so tricky.
It can be really challenging, yeah.
Memories aren't perfect.
Nope, not at all.
And there are so many things that can influence how we remember an event, especially a stressful one.
It's like our brains are constantly trying to make sense of things,
Yeah,
and sometimes that can lead to errors.
right, and that's why all those safeguards we talked about are so important.
Absolutely. Things like sequential presentation and independent presenters.
Yeah, they're all designed to try to minimize those errors.
Exactly. Make the process as reliable as possible.
And of course, we can't forget about the soft no inquiry.
Right. That was a real turning point.
It led to some really important changes in the way photo packs are used,
Uh-huh.
all because of a case where someone was wrongly convicted.
A tragic reminder of why getting this right is so important.
Yeah, it really underscores the fact that even with the best procedures in place, mistakes can still happen,
Absolutely. The justice system isn't perfect.
but it's constantly evolving
It is.
and trying to improve.
To ensure fairness and accuracy.
I think that's a good note to end on, actually.
It is.
We've learned so much about the power of these tools.
Fingerprints and photographs, yeah.
They can be incredibly useful for law enforcement,
Absolutely.
but they also come with a responsibility
Uh-huh.
to use them ethically and carefully.
Right. We can't forget about those individual rights.
We've seen how the Canadian legal system tries to strike that delicate balance.
It's a complex issue, but a really important one.
It is. I think this deep dive has given us a lot to think about.
It has, yeah. It's been a great conversation.
It has, and hopefully it's given our listeners a better understanding of this fascinating area of law.
I hope so, too.
So until next time, keep those critical thinking caps on,
Stay curious out there.
and we'll see you on our next deep dive.